It's Canada's 150th birthday, and everyone's ready to celebrate, right? Wrong. Actually, a lot of people are pretty annoyed, irked, or pissed off about the fanfare that surrounded Canada 150, which has sparked a national conversation about the country's history of colonialism. But let's back up. So what's the festivities all about anyway? 2017 marks 150 years since the Confederation Act was signed, which combined the colonies Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick into one British colony. So basically, we're celebrating 150 years of colonization, which isn't necessarily a good thing. Academics, activists, and writers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, have taken to social media and written countless articles for months to call out Canada 150. From their perspective, it's actually a celebration of the birth of colonialism and cultural genocide. After all, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples have called this land home for well over 150 years.
Canada, as we talk about it today, is a myth that acknowledges only the history of Canadians of European descent. Celebrating Canada 150 is not harmless. It's celebrating and perpetuating racism and dispossession.
The land in this country wasn't won in some definitive, epic war. In some places, treaties were signed, which were meant to be a mutual agreement between Indigenous nations and Europeans to share the land and the resources and to meet certain obligations to one another. But in the past and to this day, these treaties have been broken, hence the critical slogans. And if broken treaties weren't bad enough, there are countless places where land is unceded, aka nothing was given up, but settler Canadians moved in anyway and got comfy for the last couple centuries. Essentially, in order for Canada to have become the Canada it is today, Indigenous peoples have been treated as more of an obstacle to be overcome, and less of people who actually have lived here. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, then the head of Department of Indian Affairs, said, quote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and it is no Indian question, no Indian department." He was pretty much talking about a cultural genocide, and the tactic Scott was referring to was residential schools. Indigenous students were removed from their families and forced to attend these schools, where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their culture in hopes of assimilating them. These schools gave way to physical, sexual, emotional abuse. Illness was widespread, and students were dying at such alarming rates early on that in 1920, schools stopped keeping track of the deaths altogether. And the last of these schools didn't close until 1996. And still, after surviving over a century of people trying to get rid of the Indian problem, Indigenous communities today are still affected by the intergenerational trauma of these experiences. To make matters worse, successive governments have still failed to really change course. Reserves lack access to essential services, women and girls are repeatedly failed by the justice system, youth and adults alike are overrepresented in prisons, Indigenous children's health and social welfare programs remain chronically underfunded, and the same goes for education, housing, and other essential infrastructure.
That's part of the problem with this discussion. People like to historicize it and either A, say we're really sorry for what happened in the past, or B, why don't you just get over what happened in the past? And the problem with those attitudes is it's ongoing. So it's pretty hard to get over something if it's still happening.
But all that lack of funds still hasn't stopped the government from throwing big bucks behind their own birthday party. They've allocated $500 million toward the festivities. No, more zeros. Yeah, there you go. And look, there's a lot of moments in Canada's history to be proud of, and it's not like it's a waste to spend money on culture, but be careful not to erase history in the process. What we need is a real reckoning of this country's colonial past. Indigenous peoples are having the conversation. Isn't it about time we all listen?